There are moments in history when the veil of ordinary days is torn, when the signs that once whispered now thunder, and when what was long foretold begins to draw near. We are standing at such a moment now, for the scriptures speak of times of shaking, times when darkness covers the earth, not to destroy, but to awaken. And as we approach the end of January 2026, a stirring is rising across nations. People feel it. Hearts sense it. Something is shifting, something pressing in on our world like an approaching storm. But hear this: darkness does not come to defeat the people of light. It comes to reveal them. It comes to separate fear from faith, doubt from destiny, and to call us back to the purpose for which we were made. So as the world watches the signs and wonders what is unfolding, I tell you, do not fear the 3 days of darkness, for every shadow that falls becomes the canvas on which God paints the possibility of transformation. This is not a time for trembling, it is a time for rising, a time for clarity, a time for courage, because when the days grow dark, you are called to shine brighter than ever before. There are moments in the story of nations, in the lives of people, and in the turning of ages when the world seems to hold its breath, when the currents beneath the surface shift, when the familiar rhythms tremble. We are living in such a time now. For years, signs have flickered on the horizon, subtle at first, then louder, then undeniable. And though many tried to explain them away, to quiet the stirrings inside, to drown the whisper with the noise of everyday comforts, the truth remains. There comes a moment when the whisper becomes a voice, and the voice becomes a trumpet. There comes a moment when darkness moves in, not to consume, but to confront, to awaken, to reveal. It is in this moment that the myth of convenience is shattered, and we are forced to see who we truly are. As the end of January 2026 approaches, many feel a heaviness in the atmosphere, as though the world stands on the edge of a threshold. People speak of uncertainty, of instability, of pressure building like a tide preparing to break. But deeper than all these signs is something more personal, more sacred. Darkness, whether literal or symbolic, has always been a revealer. It strips away illusions. It uncovers foundations. It brings to light what daylight politely ignores. The 3 days of darkness that so many speak of are not merely an external event. They are a spiritual mirror, a divine pause, a threshold in which the shadows expose the truth of our hearts. For in the days we call ordinary, it is easy to hide what is weak behind what appears strong. It is easy to disguise fear as confidence, compromise as compassion, distraction as peace. But when the lights dim and the noise ceases, when the familiar patterns are interrupted, we discover who we truly are. Darkness does not simply fall upon the world, it falls upon our souls, our priorities, our choices, our convictions. It tests the substance of what we have built our lives upon. And so the coming darkness, symbolic of any moment of trial, shaking, or uncertainty, stands as a divine invitation to transformation. Imagine a world where, for a brief span of days, the structures we trust are stilled. Imagine the quiet, imagine the pause in the relentless motion of human striving. For many, this would be a terror, for their identity has been forged by movement, distraction, and noise. But for others, it becomes a moment of clarity, a moment when the voice long drowned out begins to be heard again. We speak of darkness as something to fear, but throughout history, darkness has also been the birthplace of revelation. It was in darkness that creation began, the Spirit hovering over the void. It was in darkness that the prophets heard the whisper. It was in darkness that seeds took root, wombs nurtured life, and dawn prepared its ascent. In the end of January 2026, whether the world experiences literal shadow or metaphorical shaking, the meaning remains. We are being called to see ourselves not as we pretend to be, but as we truly are. For when the world darkens, the inner world illuminates. The race between light and shadow is not fought on the horizon, but within the human soul. And it is here that the real journey begins. There is a reason why people fear darkness. It is not only because we cannot see what surrounds us, it is because we cannot escape what is within us. The silence echoes, the stillness exposes, the shadows stretch long and pull to the surface the thoughts we bury under endless activity. When all external light dims, the inner light, or the lack of it, becomes unmistakable. Some discover a flame that cannot be quenched, others find an ember barely alive, and some discover an emptiness that startles them, for they never realized how much of their peace depended on circumstance rather than character. Yet this revelation is not judgment, it is mercy, it is wisdom, for no one can rise until they first know where they stand. No one can rebuild until they see what must be torn down. No one can claim courage until they have faced their fear. And darkness, in its strange and unsettling way, becomes the great revealer. It is the teacher that refuses to flatter, the prophet that refuses to lie, the mirror that refuses to distort. As the symbolic 3 days of darkness draw near, there is a stirring in human hearts, a mixture of dread, anticipation, and awakening. Some feel anxiety, sensing that the world they have known cannot continue unchanged. But others feel something even deeper, a calling, a summons, a pull toward something higher. They sense that the shaking of the world is also the shaking of souls, and that what emerges from the trial will not be the same as what entered it. Trials have always been the birthplace of greatness, not comfort, not convenience, not predictability. No one ever discovered the strength of the Yair spirit on a sunny day. No one ever found spiritual vision in a world flooded with artificial light. It is in the nights that challenge us, in the seasons that strip away pretense, in the moments when we stand alone with our deepest truths, that we uncover what we are truly made of. The darkness that approaches is not an obstacle, it is an unveiling. It is not punishment, it is preparation. It is the threshold between what was and what could be. For too long, many have drifted through life asleep with their eyes open. They move from task to task, entertainment to entertainment, comfort to comfort, never pausing long enough to ask who they are becoming. But shaking has a way of waking the sleeping. Darkness has a way of sharpening the senses, and silence has a way of revealing the voice we have ignored for too long. This moment at the end of January is not a time to fear, but a time to awaken, a time to reclaim purpose, a time to remember what truly matters. When darkness falls, literal or symbolic, it is not the strong who prevail, nor the wealthy, nor the influential. It is the grounded, the rooted, the centered. It is those whose identity is not tethered to shifting circumstances, those who have cultivated inner light through integrity, through discipline, through compassion, through truth. For when the world trembles, it is the heart anchored in meaning that stands firm. And when the lights go out, it is the soul that has nurtured its fire that becomes a beacon to others. Any fear what they cannot control. But the coming darkness is not something to control. It is something to move through. It is a moment that asks us to listen rather than strategize, to reflect rather than react. It invites us to examine the foundations of our lives. What have we built upon? What have we trusted? What have we ignored? What inner cracks have we plastered over with the illusion of stability? These are the questions that darkness forces us to confront, not to shame us, but to free us. For the truth is this: every human life is filled with rooms we rarely enter, rooms of unresolved memories, unspoken dreams, hidden fears, and untapped strength. We avoid these chambers because they require courage to face, but darkness, in its strange mercy, leads us into them. It removes the distractions that keep us from self-honesty. It quiets the noise that drowns out our deeper calling. It brings us face to face with who we are, and even more importantly, who we could become. There are those who say that darkness is the enemy of light, but in reality, darkness often becomes its servant. For it is only against the backdrop of shadow that light reveals its full brilliance. It is only when the night deepens that the stars appear. And it is only when the familiar lights go out that we discover the light we carry within. The 3 days of darkness, whether experienced outwardly, inwardly, or metaphorically, are not a threat to be feared, but a revelation to be embraced. Some will use his moment to panic, to cling to what is fading, to grasp the fragments of a world in transition. But others will rise. They will see the darkness not as a wall, but as a doorway. They will recognize that the shaking of foundations is also the clearing of ground for something new. They will understand that the interruption of routine is the invitation to destiny. For darkness, when understood rightly, is not the cancellation of purpose, but the catalyst of purpose. And so, as this symbolic moment approaches, the question is not what will happen around you, but what will happen within you. Will you hide from the darkness, or will you let it reveal your strength? Will you run from the silence, or will you listen for the voice within it? Will you cling to the fading light of comfort, or will you ignite the flame of conviction? The approaching darkness is not the test of the world, it is the test of the soul. And every soul that embraces it with courage will emerge transformed, for no one comes out of darkness unchanged. It shapes us, refines us, purifies us. It strips away the unnecessary and illuminates the essential. It teaches us to see without relying on the eyes. It teaches us to walk by truth rather than sight. It teaches us that the greatest light is not found in the sky, but in the depths of the human spirit. The darkness coming at the end of January 2026, symbolic or real, is not an ending but a beginning. It is the doorway through which we step into deeper wisdom, deeper strength, deeper purpose. And so we stand at the threshold. The world whispers of uncertainty, but the Spirit whispers of awakening. The night may come, but with it comes revelation. And in that revelation, we finally see who we truly are and who we are meant to become. There comes a time in every generation when the ground beneath their feet begins to tremble, when the structures that once seemed unshakable begin to groan, when what was hidden behind the comfort of routine is suddenly brought into the open. That time is not marked by chaos alone, but by clarity. For shaking does not come merely to unsettle, it comes to awaken. It is the ancient pattern found in the rise and fall of civilizations, in the stories of prophets and kings, in the journeys of every soul who has ever sought meaning beyond the surface of things. And now, as the world moves toward the end of January 2026, many feel that a shaking, a great spiritual, emotional, and societal shift is drawing near, one that will call the sleeping to rise. Shaking has always been misunderstood. People see it as a sign of collapse, a prelude to disaster. But shaking has another purpose: to separate what is weak from what is strong, what is temporary from what is eternal, what is shallow from what is true. Shaking reveals foundations. It exposes what has been ignored, neglected, or forgotten. And when it arrives, it is not the destruction of life, but the summoning of life. For nothing awakens the soul more profoundly than the moment when all the illusions tremble and fall away, leaving only what is real. Most people spend their lives sheltered by the illusion of stability. They assume that tomorrow will resemble today, that the systems built by human hands will hold, that comfort will continue without interruption. But history has never honored these expectations. History has always moved in cycles. Periods of building followed by periods of shaking, seasons of calm followed by seasons of testing. And in every cycle, those who awaken early rise above the storm, while those who remain asleep are swept away by it. At the end of January 2026, the world finds itself on the edge of such a cycle, the symbolic 3 days of darkness that people speak of reflect something deeper, something far more significant than any external phenomenon. They point to the shaking that is coming upon human hearts and minds. A shaking that will separate fear from courage, truth from deception, faith from complacency. This is not merely a warning, it is a calling for those who have slumbered in the comfort of routine to rise and reclaim the purpose for which they were made. The shaking comes first to the inner world. It begins with a stirring, a sense that the familiar no longer satisfies, that the old patterns no longer fit, that the things once trusted now crumble like dust in the hands. People feel restless, searching, drawn towards something they cannot name. They sense the pressure building around them, social tension, emotional exhaustion, spiritual emptiness. But the deeper shaking is within. It is the soul waking up after years of spiritual slumber, stretching as if remembering that it was meant for more than drifting through life half alive. And then the shaking spreads to the outer world. The structures of society begin to tremble. The systems that once promised stability begin to crack. People who built their identity on the shifting sands of opinion, status, or material security feel suddenly exposed. The shaking does not discriminate. It touches governments, institutions, relationships, economies, and personal convictions. It uproots what has grown too comfortable and unsettles what has grown too complacent. Not to destroy, but to awaken, for if nothing ever shook, nothing would ever change. If nothing ever unsettled us, we would remain asleep forever. Shaking is the ancient instrument of transformation. It is the moment when the seeds buried deep beneath the earth are forced upward, when the walls we built around our hearts crumble so that truth can enter, when the complacency that numbs our purpose is shattered so that passion can rise again. There are those who fear the coming shaking, for they sense the instability it brings. But the shaking is not the threat. The shaking is the mercy. Imagine a house built on a foundation that is cracked and hollow. Without shaking, the house might stand for years, giving the illusion of stability while the danger grows quietly within. But when the earth trembles, the cracks reveal themselves. The hidden weaknesses are exposed. And though the shaking may frighten the inhabitants, it saves them from a collapse far more devastating than the shaking itself. So it is with the soul. The shaking is not our downfall, it is our rescue. People often ask why the world must be shaken at all. Why not allow everything to continue as it is? But the answer is simple. Because we are not meant to live half awake. Because humanity has drifted into a spiritual sleep so deep that only a shaking can rouse it. Comfort has lulled many into complacency. Technology has replaced introspection. Distraction has numbed the longing for meaning. People rough their days without ever confronting the emptiness beneath the surface. And so the shaking comes, not as punishment, but as awakening. Not to frighten, but to illuminate. The symbolic darkness at the end of January 2026 is a moment when the shaking will bring clarity. For in darkness, symbols are sharper. In silence, truth is louder. In stillness, the soul becomes visible. Shaking interrupts the noise of everyday life. And in that interruption, we finally hear what we have been ignoring for too long. We hear the questions we avoided. We hear the calling we dismissed. We hear the truth we drowned out with comfort. Shaking calls the sleeping to rise, but rising is not automatic. It requires choice. It requires courage. It requires self-honesty. When everything familiar trembles, the human instinct is to cling tightly to whatever remains. But shaking demands that we release our grip on what is temporary so that we may grasp what is eternal. It demands that we examine the foundations of our identity, our priorities, our faith, our character. For when the shaking comes, it does not ask who we were in comfortable times. It asks who we are when the illusions fall away. Some will resist the shaking. They will try to rebuild the old routines, reattach themselves to the crumbling structures, silence the inner voice calling them to rise. They will cling to the fading lights of distraction, hoping to restore what was rather than embrace what could be. But others will awaken. They will sense that the shaking is not a threat, but an invitation. They will understand that the disruption of the old is the preparation for the new. They will recognize that the shaking is not breaking them, it is freeing them. For shaking breaks chains. It breaks the chains of fear that hold people back from their calling. It breaks the chains of addiction to comfort that keep them from growth. It breaks the chains of illusion that blind them to truth. It breaks the chains of self-doubt that prevent them from living fully. Shaking breaks, but only so that something greater can be built in its place. Every great movement in history began with shaking. The shaking of a people who realized they could no longer live in bondage. The shaking of a mind that suddenly saw the world with new eyes. The shaking of a heart that refused to stay silent. Shaking precedes awakening. Awakening precedes transformation. And transformation precedes purpose. This is the pattern repeated across centuries, across cultures, across every soul who has dared to rise. The shaking approaching the world, symbolized by the dark days at the end of January 2026, is calling a generation to rise. Rise above fear, rise above distraction, rise above apathy, rise into clarity, conviction, courage, rise into the identity they were meant to carry. For in times of shaking, the ones who rise are not the ones who know all the answers, but the ones who refuse to remain asleep. Those who awaken do not fear the shaking because they understand it. They know that without shaking, nothing hidden would ever be brought to light. Without shaking, the dormant gifts within them would never be stirred. Without shaking, the strength they never knew they possessed would remain buried. Awakening occurs only when the soul realizes that the shaking is the very thing that unlocks its potential. The world may tremble, but those who awaken stand firm. They see what others cannot. They perceive meaning in the chaos. They understand that the shaking is not a sign of the end, but the sign of a beginning. For beginnings often disguise themselves as disruptions. New life often arrives as upheaval. Transformation often appears first as loss. But those who awaken recognize that the shaking clears the path for something greater. Imagine a forest floor thick with fallen branches, thorns, and debris. As long as the ground remains undisturbed, nothing new can grow. But when the earth trembles and the debris is shifted, the soil is turned, and the clutter is cleared away, space is created for new seeds to take root. The shaking prepares the ground. It prepares the heart. It prepares the soul. People speak of the darkness as something to dread, but darkness precedes dawn. They speak of shaking as something to fear, but shaking precedes renewal. They speak of uncertainty as something to avoid, but uncertainty precedes discovery. The shaking at the end of January is calling us to rise, not because the world is ending, but because a new chapter is beginning. A chapter in which those who once drifted through life asleep will awaken with clarity and purpose. In every era, there are those who sleep through their moment and those who rise to meet it. The shaking will reveal which one we are. For rising is not a matter of strength, but of surrender. It is the willingness to let go of what no longer serves us. The willingness to step into the unknown. The willingness to trust that shaking has purpose. The willingness to believe that we were created for more than comfort. The willingness to awaken, and so the shaking draws near, not as an enemy, but as a messenger. Not as a destroyer, but as a catalyst. Not as a threat, but as a call. A call to rise from spiritual sleep. A call to reclaim forgotten purpose. A call to awaken to truth, identity, and destiny. For shaking calls the sleeping to rise, and only those who rise will step into the future prepared, strengthened, and unshakable.